We're going to try something different today. So I've been connecting with a lot of newer developers and people who want to get into software development. So I have had a lot of questions about what language should I learn? What's easy to learn? What can I find a job learning? So I thought I would take an opportunity to try something kind of fun and put together a tier list of languages based on new developer friendliness. So a couple different categories. So one, this needs to be something that you can find a job in. A lot of people are trying to move into software development to find a new job or a new career. And I'm not going to tell you to learn something that is not going to help you do that. The second thing, it should be easy to learn, relatively easy to learn. There are some languages that are more complex than others. I'm sure if you are one of my normal subscribers, you have a couple in mind already. But we're really looking for things that are easy for newer devs to pick up, or at least get started with. 3, there should be really good documentation, or a lot of documentation that people can learn from. Maybe not just documentation, but tools to help them along in their development journey, to help them get started and to help them grow. So without further ado, we're just going to jump into a tier maker. I thought this would be fun. So if you know these languages, fantastic. If you don't know what these languages are, we'll talk about them. So our very first one, this is, I believe this is assembly. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to put this in D tier. And the reason why is that assembly is very, very powerful. It's very fast. It's sometimes still used in embedded systems or systems where you're programming directly on a chip. But the reality is that while there are jobs that do that, there are far more jobs in like the web space. So we'll see that some web technologies are a little higher up there. Also, assembly is really hard to learn. At least I find it really hard to learn. And then on top of that, your flavor of assembly can change depending on the processor or the chip that you are trying to code against. Yeah, fun. So Bash, I'm going to put in B tier. Bash is really powerful. People who know Bash, let me rephrase that. Knowing Bash can be a really powerful skill to help up-level you as a developer. That being said, you probably won't find job opportunities just writing Bash scripts. That may have been a thing in the past with like deployment scripts. Now it's less common. That being said, still Bash is used all over the place. Getting comfortable with Bash is going to make you faster and better at many of your other tasks. Okay, C. I am also... I'm going to put C in C tier. C is a very powerful programming language that's just a layer above assembly, and it adds a nice little abstraction point so you're not writing assembler instructions. Problems with C, and these aren't necessarily problems, but these are problems for new developers. So with C, you have to manually allocate and deallocate your memory. You use keywords like malloc to allocate memory. Most other languages, actually, no other languages on the list are going to make you do that. And this is just an extra overhead for new developers when they're learning how to code. They have to think, did I allocate the memory for this? That being said, one thing that you'll learn from doing this in C that you won't learn from other languages, every time you write a line of code, you'll start to consider the memory implications of that line of code. Are you allocating memory on the heap? If you're a C dev, I have a theory, a hunch, if you will, that you are going to be much more proficient in identifying memory issues and memory allocations in code, regardless of if it's in C or something else. Okay, C++. So if C is a layer above assembler instructions, C++ is a layer added on to C. I'm going to put this in B tier. It seems kind of, I'd say around the same tier level as Bash. So C++ is a really interesting language. It's extremely fast. It's extremely powerful. It's used for all sorts of things all over the world. That being said, it suffers from some of the same problems that you have with C, where you are more concerned about memory management on your own, and you don't have tools to necessarily help you with that. And then in addition, C is a very interesting language where there are different flavors of C++, and if you started writing C++ when I started writing C++, and then you looked at modern day C++, it's very different. It feels very different to me, at least. And I guess what I'm getting at is like that documentation. If you find older C++ documentation, it might not be as relevant as newer C++ documentation, and I feel like there are fewer and fewer people writing in C++ over time, so you're more likely to find some of that older documentation. That being said, if you want a language that is blazingly fast, C++, C, and assembler are your go-tos. But it's all about trade-offs, right? And the trade-offs are that they're a little harder to learn, and there's more overhead for how you manage memory in your code. Okay, for one that's not much like C, we have C#. So this, I believe C#'s named because it follows the C-style family of language, which a lot of these do, and we'll get into more of those in a bit. But C# was developed by Microsoft. C# runs on the .NET framework, generally, although you can run it without .NET, but I feel like that's, there are some cases where that's still common. I think Unity uses C#, the game development framework, and it doesn't run on .NET, so there's C# with Unity. But it's a language built by Microsoft, and it's an object-oriented programming language, which so is C++. And you build objects, and you have properties on those objects, and you do things with it. I put C in the A tier. Sorry, I put C# in the A tier because there are a lot of C# jobs, at least in the US. And I should probably caveat this by saying my exposure to programming jobs is mostly in the United States. But there are a lot of C# jobs in the US, especially in the Midwest of the US. I'm not sure how, but Microsoft feels like they got a clutch on the Midwest, and due to that, a lot of shops use C#. Anything else to say about C#? There's really good documentation. Microsoft sponsors it. They have really great documentation. They have conferences every year. I think they do them all virtually as well now, too. So even if you can't go to the conference to learn about C#, you can go to .NET Conf online and have a virtual experience where you stay up to date on the C# and .NET changes and learn more. It's a pretty easy language to learn and pretty good employability as well. Is this CSS? Is this what this is supposed to be? Let's find out. Yeah, okay, that is CSS. Interesting. It's so weird seeing it gray. Okay, CSS, A tier. CSS is a really interesting language. It's short for cascading style sheets. And it is not a Turing complete. It might be now. It might be Turing complete now, but I wouldn't write actual programs in CSS if you can. My hunch is that it's not Turing complete, but that is also out-of-date research on my end. Anyways, CSS is a language for styling the web. So if you want to change the color of buttons on a web page, you're probably going to write CSS. If you want to change the size of pieces of content on the web page, or the font family, or the height of a container, you're probably going to write CSS. I'm putting CSS in the A tier because it's an extremely great skill to have, and it's part of the web dev trio, which we'll get to. Actually, we'll jump to the rest of the web dev trio here in just a second. But it's a part of the web dev trio that is used to build modern websites. So there is front-end development and back-end development and a couple other types of development. But for the sake of web dev, front-end development is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And this is CSS. So if that's the trio, let's talk about HTML. HTML is A tier, for me at least. So if you're building websites, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you're going to use all three, and the world runs on the web. There are so many jobs out there that are doing web development. So many jobs out there that are doing front-end or back-end development. And while you're not going to write HTML or CSS on the back-end necessarily, these are the tools that you're going to use to make sure that your web page is accessible and presentable and semantic. It has meaningful content for the people that are trying to access it. The third part of the trio is JavaScript. JavaScript's going to be S tier. The JavaScript ecosystem has boomed over the past, it's 2024, 14 years, 15 years. So JavaScript was a long time ago. I believe it was Netscape. They tried to figure out a way to do server-side JavaScript, and they did. But it never really seemed to catch on. So JavaScript mostly was used as a client-side programming language, ran in web browsers as a part of the trio, which is, again, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So when you're making web pages, you would use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So JavaScript is great to know. However, the reason it's S tier as opposed to A tier is the JavaScript ecosystem's boomed. There are frameworks that are way more complex that help you build performant UIs and reactive UIs, like React is a popular one. Vue is another popular one. Svelte, my favorite one. However, you can also use JavaScript on the back end now, and it's extremely popular. It's used in all sorts of technologies. There's a framework called Express that is built around server-side JavaScript, so building APIs in JavaScript. Svelte has a piece to it called Svelte Kit, which is a server-side framework written in JavaScript. There's a concept called GraphQL, and there's a really great GraphQL engine server thing called Apollo that's written in JavaScript. So it's all over the place. JavaScript, if you picked one language on this list to learn for employability, resources, and then ease of learning, it'd be JavaScript. Also, JavaScript's dynamic. It's a dynamic programming language where a lot of the other ones we've talked about are statically typed. In the grand scheme of things, I think statically typed languages are generally better. They offer safety nets, but sometimes what that means is that safety net is the compiler. That safety net is the compiler. And sometimes what that means is instead of making a change and actually seeing how it affects the web page or how it affects your server, you make a change and then the compiler tells you you did something wrong. One of the things I really like about JavaScript for beginners is that you can make a change and see how it impacts your web page, even if your code's not necessarily completely correct. JavaScript's a weird language. There are a lot of talks that are that show some of the oddities of JavaScript, and it is an odd language. There are some things that it behaves in ways that you might not expect. So those are things that you get to learn and you get familiar with, but really a lot of that is trying to make sure that it doesn't break. It's up to you whether you prefer for something to break when you're building it, or if you prefer for it to exhibit unexpected behavior. And JavaScript will often do the unexpected behavior route. However, there are tools that are being built to help prevent that. Actually, a really great one that I don't see on this list is called TypeScript, which adds static typing to JavaScript. If that was up here, I would also put it in S tier. In fact, maybe we'll try to find it and add it here later. Okay, so we jumped out of line for the web dev trio. We're going to come back to Fortran. Fortran is, truth be told, I don't know a ton about Fortran. I know it's an older language. I wrote a little bit of Fortran 76. That's 1976, the year it was that release came out, at least. When I was exploring it many years ago, just to kind of learn a little bit more about it. And don't have a ton of knowledge about Fortran besides that. I know there are jobs out there. I think the amount of new projects being started in Fortran are very, very few. So my hunch is that as there are people who are developing Fortran and probably being paid pretty well to maintain existing systems, those systems are going away over time. And it may take hundreds of years. But the reality is that new development is not often being done in Fortran. And because of that, there's not a lot of new opportunities in Fortran. There are always going to be people needed to backfill maintaining code bases when Fortran developers retire. So there's a couple of opportunities there, but it's not a language that is you're not seeing a lot of new development with. On top of that, I don't really know what the docs look like. It's not a very popular language, so outside of the standard documentation, I don't think you're going to see a lot of blog posts about it to kind of guide you through new ideas. I don't think you're going to see a lot of tech talks about it or videos about it. And then, what was our third one? Employability, ease of learning. I don't have a ton of information about how easy it is to learn. I'm going to put it in F tier. I think the employability is really bad, and it's just a language that is still being maintained and there are projects still being maintained in it, but it's dying off for new projects. And I think you want to invest a little bit more in your future if you're a new dev. Okay, next one. So our next one's going to be Go. So this is the Go programming language. This is our Gopher. Go is a language that I like quite a bit. It's a statically typed programming language. It was kind of built to solve some of the complaints about C++ and give you similar use cases or be used in similar cases. So with Go, you get pretty performant computing. It's pretty fast. It's considered the cloud native language. So a lot of cloud native tooling is built with Go, and it's a great language for that. Some highlights, it has a really great standard library, and generally speaking, the community tends to focus on building things with the standard library more than they do pulling in other code, which means that once you kind of have a good understanding of the Go standard library, you generally have a pretty good understanding of a good chunk of most Go programs. Documentation, it's a newer language, so there's not as much documentation as you might find in like JavaScript, but by newer language, I think it came out in 2011, maybe. There are a lot of really great pieces of documentation. Popularity for Go continues to grow, and more people are learning Go and writing about Go, and contributing to projects written in Go, some open source, some closed. So ease of learning, really, it focuses on simplicity as a language, which is fantastic for beginners. But it's type safe and has the compiler there to help kind of guide you through things that you might be making mistakes with. I will say one of the complexities that you run into with Go is that you get into a concept known as pointers, which C++ and C also have. But pointers are a way to refer to memory by address. So all of the memory in your computer has a memory address, and whenever you store things in it, you create like a variable, and you will allocate memory for that variable, but you also get a pointer to it. And languages like JavaScript and stuff like that kind of obscure this from you, so you're not worried about it. But with Go, you do need to know whether you're working with pointers or whether you're working with the values themselves. And then Go also has an idea of passing a pointer if you want to pass by a reference, or passing a value, passing not a pointer, if you want to pass by value. So sometimes that can trip new people up with Go, but generally it's a really great language to learn. It's growing in popularity, and as more and more people move to cloud native solutions, Go just continues to keep growing. Okay, time for another detour. So this is Haskell. There are jobs out in Haskell. There are jobs out there for Haskell. They pay generally very, very well. It is a very safe language. Like, it focuses on type soundness through and through, which means the when you write code in Haskell, everything is typed to the point that it has to be correct. So which sounds like a great thing, right? It does. But Haskell gives you the tools for very intricate type systems, which also sounds great. But a lot of times what that means is that you can end up spending a ton of time focusing on building a type system and not actually building a project. I am guilty of doing this with Scala, which also is not on this list now that I see that. So there are opportunities out there. They pay pretty well, but there aren't a lot of Haskell opportunities out there. In addition, Haskell has a very algorithmic focus, and it is a functional language. In fact, I think it's the first fully functional language that we've talked about on this list. So functional, not meaning functioning as in like it works, but focusing on functions as first-class citizens. So generally, some of the things that turn people off from Haskell are the idea of working with things like monads, which if you don't know, my advice would be to, if you're very curious, Google it. And if you're a junior dev who is trying to figure out what they should work with, maybe Google it in a year or two. They can be some of the concepts that are captured in Haskell can be very complex, especially for people who are just trying to figure out how to make code work. So that's employability, ease of use for new devs, and then documentation. I assume the documentation for Haskell is pretty good. The language itself is very sound, so I assume the documentation's probably sound, but it's not something I've explored a ton. Let's take a look. Haskell documentation. Okay, so there's haskell.org. Oh, this book. Yeah, let's talk about this for a second. I've heard this book is fantastic. And you can read it online for free. So if you do want to learn Haskell, for whatever reason, you choose this one, and this is the language you want to use. Maybe it's this little sun up here that's convinced you. I would recommend this book. I've heard great things. It's by No Starch Press, or they publish it. They publish a couple things that are also pretty good, like the Common Lisp book, I believe, is published by them as well. And I think we'll get to Common Lisp in a moment. But yeah, this would be where I would recommend starting. The documentation also has things like Learn Haskell by building a blog generator, and some other things that might be helpful if Haskell is the thing that you want to learn. Okay. All right, let's close some tabs. Java. I'm going to put Java in B tier. Java is the first language that I got started with. It's changed a lot since I started writing Java. My takeaway is that C# is a nicer Java. And it's hard to say that, and I'm sure the Java people are going to come out of the woods and say they're not the same, and they're not. I totally agree with that. Syntactically, they're very similar. Java runs on the Java virtual machine, so if you've ever had your computer pop up and say, you have a Java update available, that's the thing that runs your Java code. And C# and Java are very, very similar. So you structure most of the things in classes, although I'd say C# is maybe more flexible at this point with that. But you structure everything in classes, and you have methods on objects or classes, and then you have properties, and you do things in an object-oriented programming way. C# has namespaces and a couple other things that make it unique. Actually, quite a few things that make it unique at this point. And while Java is still around, and they're still developing it, and there are actually a fairly good number of jobs with Java out there, it feels like it's dropping in popularity, but it's still very useful. Also, if you're wanting to build Android apps, Java is one of the options you have available for you at this point in time. That may change, it may not, I'm not sure, but that's actually a really great segue into our next language. So before we jump to that, employability, yeah, there's quite a few jobs out there for Java. I don't know how much that area is growing, but I think that if you learn Java, it's a pretty safe bet that there are jobs out there, and there will continue to be for a while. Beginner friendliness, it's decent. There's a lot of boilerplate in Java code, and a lot of that can be kind of frustrating when you're first starting out. So I guess that's something to keep in mind. So if we search for Hello World Java, you will get a program like this. This doesn't look that bad, right? So this prints hello. Well, actually, it prints my first Java program to the console. This is okay, right? But maybe, let's see, do they have a JavaScript one? No, they don't. Okay. Let's look at the JavaScript equivalent. There you go. Way less boilerplate. And when you're just starting out, that boilerplate is just an area for you to make a mistake. And then you have the compiler telling you that you've made a mistake, and you have to figure out exactly what's wrong. So that can be kind of frustrating. As for resources, they're pretty good. Java documentation is great. I am going to shout out a specific creator here in just a second. But the Java documentation has been around for a really long time. It's pretty good. There are libraries for doing all sorts of fun things like embedded Java. There's a library called Java FX if you want to do fancy visual stuff in Java. Oh, it's open source now too. That's great. And then there's this really great creator, Baildung. I'm not sure if that's his actual name or just his site name or their name. I don't even know if the person... I don't know much about the person who actually maintains the site. But they have resources for Spring, which is a very popular framework written in Java. And Spring Boot, Spring REST, Spring Data, Spring Security, they have it all. And then they also have tutorials for Java. And I've not actually gone through their Java tutorials, but I have done their tutorials on Spring, specifically Spring Boot, Spring REST, and Spring... Oh, I don't see the other one. Oh, I'm sorry, there it is, Spring Reactive. And then they have other sites as well for other languages too. The quality of their tutorials are really great. The Java stuff, I, again, have not really gone into, but control structures in Java. So everything's broken apart. And one of the things I really like about his site, or their site, is he maybe standard author of the site. Okay. Not helpful. But one of the things I really like about the articles on the site is that they are thorough, yet focused on being understandable. So sometimes people will teach something that is maybe not correct in an effort to make it easier to understand, but it's close enough to correct. And a lot of the things I've found on the site, that's not the case. They teach you the truly correct thing, and they do a very good job of making it simple enough for you to understand, which is fantastic. Okay, I think that covers the 3. So our next one is Kotlin. I'm going to put it in B tier. So Kotlin is a language that was built by JetBrains. They make a very popular IDE, integrated development environment. If you're unfamiliar with that term, it's a fancy code editor focused on editing code instead of writing, Word documents or something like that. Kotlin was built kind of as a replacement for Java. So it can run on the Java virtual machine. It can also run in a couple other places. You can also compile it out to other languages. It's a really nice, flexible solution. That being said, most of the time people do run it on the Java virtual machine. And it was built kind of as a replacement for Java in the Android ecosystem. So most new Android applications, to my knowledge, end up using Kotlin. When I was working as an Android architect, we were focused on Kotlin. Also, you can use Kotlin in place of Java just about anywhere now. So if you're building Spring Boot web servers, you might be using Java, or you might be using Kotlin. You kind of have options for both. As for jobs, it seems on the rise. I would say that there are fewer Kotlin jobs than there are Java jobs right now, but it's on the rise. And specifically, most Android-focused mobile apps seem to be going towards Kotlin. So if Android continues to grow in popularity, in theory, there will be more and more Kotlin jobs, specifically in the mobile space. That being said, you can use it on the back end. I know companies that are doing it on the back end and love it. So there's opportunities there as well. Ease of learning, it's good. It is, I feel like I should show you the Kotlin hello world, since we just looked at the Java one and the JavaScript one. It's not as simple as the JavaScript one, but it's really simple compared to the Java one. There is not a lot of boilerplate, which makes this nice, but it is, fairly type safe and sound, which also is helpful. And then resources for learning it. Kotlin documentation is really good. They have a really fancy site for the Kotlin programming language. If it loads, yep, there's JetBrains, the company that I mentioned. So you can, click the Get Started link. They have a Kotlin tour, which will walk you through everything you need to know. So you'll learn about variables, basic types, collections, control flow, functions, classes, null safety, etc. And it'll just kind of walk you through all of that, which is really great. Tons of other resources. I actually had a microsite when I was doing Android stuff called Kotlin Today that was a blog aggregator. It has since shut down, so I am not doing that anymore. But there are people posting blogs in Kotlin, and have been for a while, pretty frequently, so a lot of resources to learn from there as well. I don't know what this is. Oh, LaTeX. Oh, okay. Sure. I don't... Okay. LaTeX is an interesting language. So LaTeX is a tool for building really rich documents. Sometimes it's used in an academic setting to build term papers or scientific papers, things of that nature. I don't know of any jobs that would require you to use it or expect you to have LaTeX experience outside of an academic setting. It is pretty strict, to my understanding. Truth be told, I've not written actually as much LaTeX at all, but it is pretty strict, which makes it a little less beginner friendly. And then in addition to that, the resources for learning it, to my knowledge, LaTeX documentation is probably your best bet. So you can find documentation here, general documentation, how to use it with PageMark, just some other examples like that. This seems neat. I've not explored this, but there is a LaTeX editor called Overleaf that might make building LaTeX documents even easier. Okay. Lisp. Oh, man, I love Lisp. But I don't know how... I would maybe put it higher than Haskell. This is tricky. I think there are probably fewer common Lisp jobs than there are Haskell jobs. So let's just go ahead and clear the air about that. That being said, I do feel like common Lisp is significantly easier to learn. So the main shtick with common Lisp is LISP. It stands list processor, LISP, list processor. I think that's correct. And the key thing is that this is very different than almost every other programming language that we've talked about so far. So everything above this, except for Bash and CSS and HTML, are C-style languages. So they're kind of based on this C programming language. Haskell is a functional programming language, and it is, I believe it's more aligned to like the Meta family of functional programming languages. Common Lisp is a Lisp, which is also a functional programming language. But the idea here is that your code is essentially data. It's a list of instructions, which means you have a lot of function calls, but it's also nice and easy to learn because anytime you want to do something, you call a function. And if you don't have a function to do the thing that you want it to do, you write a function, and that function is composed of other functions. And that's how Common Lisp works. So it's different. It's very different. But it is something that I think was actually probably not a difficult thing to learn once you get started. I will add that if you start with a C-style language, this is going to be a really weird transition. I think there's a lot of value in that, and you'll learn a lot from it as well. But just expect that, like, if you start with Java or JavaScript or Kotlin or Go, and then you later want to learn Common Lisp, it's going to be a little tricky. Not to say that you shouldn't do that, or that you should start with Common Lisp. I think this is S tier for a reason, and these are A for a reason. But I just want to stress that it's a different language. And honestly, the best way to do this would be to give you an actual code example of Common Lisp. So let's talk about a code example. Here you go. So this is actually a DSL that is written in Common Lisp, I guess, a macro-based SQL DSL. So you can see this is a function, the select function, and then this is I think this is probably a tuple or some form of indicator of what we're selecting. Here's another function called from. It takes in a keyword for a table name. Here's another function called where, which takes in another function, and you can see like it's a lot of functions. And what that means to a lot of people is that it's a lot of parentheses. So Common Lisp gets a bad rap for having a lot of parentheses, but oftentimes it doesn't have too many more parentheses than you would have in a C-style language. It's just the ordering is different. So in a C-style language, you know, the word select would be to the left of the parentheses instead of the first item in the parentheses. One of the benefits of this is that this is a list, and this is a list, and this is a list, and this is a list. And Common Lisp is good at working with lists. So you can treat your code as a list and do processing to your code, since it is just a list of data, and do processing with things like macros and other fun tools to help kind of translate your code as well. Truth be told, most of my Common Lisp experience is not Common Lisp. It is another language called Clojure, which is a Lisp, just like Common Lisp, but it's built on the JVM. So this is another alternative to Java or Kotlin or Scala, and it is a very interesting language. I wish I remembered the docs better, because I would love to be able to give you a very quick example of what a Clojure program might look like. But needless to say, it's actually very similar to Common Lisp. Okay, so jobs, probably not a ton. It's a very flexible, dynamic language, and as long as you understand that everything is a list, your code is a list, of commands, and each of those commands are a function. It's pretty easy to get a fundamental understanding of the language. And then the documentation is pretty good, which reminds me, Common Lisp book. What is the book? Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? No starch. Land of Lisp. There we go. Could not remember what it was called. This is where their mascot comes from. So there's this book called The Land of Lisp. It's a silly book that teaches you to program Lisp via games. So you build one game at a time, and you learn different concepts in Lisp as you go. I have read a chunk of this book, but not the whole thing. It's very good, at least the stuff that I have read. And also, it's kind of old, 2010 at this point, but it's still relevant today. Or I would say it's still relevant today. If you want to get a look at kind of what you're getting into, you can look at a chapter, This Ain't Your Daddy's Wumpus. And then they also have their own site called Land of Lisp. Well, they used to. They might not anymore. Okay, next one, Lua. Lua's interesting. I like this language a lot. I don't know what the job prospects look like, and I don't feel like it's comparable to Java or C++ or Kotlin, so I'm going to have to go lower. Lua is a scripting language, so kind of similar to JavaScript in that sense. But Lua was built to be embeddable. So Lua is used in a lot of game runtimes. So they'll build the engine with like C++, and then they'll embed Lua as a scripting option to run scripts as a part of their game, which ends up working fairly well, enough that people keep doing it. So if you were to build a World of Warcraft add-on, you would use Lua. There's a language called there's an editor called NeoVim that uses Lua to manage its configuration and to script it. It's really neat, and it's really cool to see a language being used that way. But as far as jobs go, I don't know what the prospects look like outside of the game industry. Ease of use, yeah, it's actually a pretty easy language to learn. It's flexible. It's not... It's a small language and it's flexible. I don't feel like it is necessarily a lot to take in all at once. And then also the documentation's pretty good. So you can search for Lua, find documentation. There are some books if books are kind of your thing. I was hoping for more clear examples. Sorry, this is not what I was looking for. Getting started, maybe. Yeah, okay, cool. So this is like an example of a Lua program. And you could follow this guide. You could find other ones. There are a fair number of resources out there. And honestly, some of the best people to learn Lua from would be people who work on NeoVim plugins. Plugins for that editor that I mentioned. The Primogen... this guy, he does some Lua stuff with he has a plugin called Harpoon, and he does a little bit of NeoVim stuff. TJ DeVries does a fair amount more with NeoVim and plugins, and he maintains quite a few plugins for NeoVim, as well as a distro, I believe. I think he maintains one of them. So yeah. Excellent people to learn more Lua from as well. That being said, I don't know if they have many Lua videos specifically, so you might kind of have to pick apart the NeoVim parts versus the Lua parts. Okay, what else do we have? Matlab. Matlab is an interesting language. To my knowledge, it's not open source. It's also very expensive for companies to use, but it's used for mathematical computing. Due to it being expensive and there being decent open source alternatives, I don't think it's super popular anymore, or if it ever really was. So the job prospects, not super great. I've heard that it's a really gross language to work with. I don't pay for the expensive MATLAB experience, so I have not developed in it. But, not a video. Nope. Let's see. Do we have any code examples? No code examples. That's how you know it's good. Yeah, I would not recommend MATLAB. In fact, I actually maybe would put it further down. I would recommend Haskell over MATLAB and assembly over MATLAB. So yes, I would put it in F tier. So job prospects, probably not great. Ease of use, I've heard the language is really terrible to work with, so I don't think it's very easy to use. I have no experience with MATLAB, kind of going off of what I know from public knowledge here, or public word of mouth. And then documentation, I would imagine the documentation's pretty good since it's a paid product, but I just don't know. We're going to skip MySQL because it is a technology and not so much a language. And it's a little bit of both, but it's used for database queries. So if you have a database and you want to query data from that database, you could use MySQL, provided you're using a MySQL database. There are other options like PostgreSQL that is another database, and you would use PostgreSQL instead of MySQL to query a Postgres database. There are other options as well. It's a database, and there's a language that comes with that database that you use to query data or insert data or update data. So we're going to skip that one for here. Oh, Lord. Perl. So Perl's a neat language. Not more useful than Haskell. Probably about the same. There have been Perl jobs in the past. It used to be quite popular for scripting and CGI scripting in particular. But Perl's an interesting language. The joke about Perl is that you could slap the keyboard and it would be a valid Perl program, which is great when you're just starting out because it allows you to make typos and you can kind of still run your code and see what's going on. And then you just kind of have to figure out, what did I do wrong with my code, which maybe isn't as great. It's becoming less and less popular, so it was used for scripting some things for a while, and it seems more and more like people are going towards Python for scripting, or Bash, or PowerShell, or what else? Using tools that maybe aren't scripted and are more configuration-based, like Terraform. So Perl's maybe becoming less and less popular. Job prospects, probably similar to Haskell at this point. There might be a little bit more in terms of job prospects, just because it was so widely used, but I don't think you're going to be using it much for maintaining for new projects. It would be mostly maintaining existing projects. What else? Documentation. Perl documentation's pretty good. The camel's interesting because there's an O'Reilly Perl book. O'Reilly Perl book. This one that is generally considered very, very good. So that's where they get their mascot, because this book chose to put the camel on the front, and it's very, very good. And that's probably what I would recommend if you really want to learn Perl. I'm sure they have documentation, the Perl programming language, docs, and you can kind of see what this looks like. Somewhere in here, is there not a getting started guide? Learn. Okay, let's try that. Learnperl.org. Yeah, so like, here's how to read and write to a file. Eesh. Not my cup of tea, but maybe it is for someone. But there is documentation. It looks like it's fairly up to date. They probably shell out hard for the Perl book because it's very good. Amazon. Yep, the Perl book. So maybe start there if Perl is the thing that you want to learn, although I don't necessarily think I would recommend it as opposed to some of the other options that you have available. Where is our... Here it is. Okay, PHP, B tier. This language is... it's interesting. This language gets a lot of a bad rap. So PHP was the language of the web when I first started getting into programming. Most of the web ran on PHP. Fun fact, most of the web today still runs on PHP. Predominantly, maybe not predominantly, but in large part due to the fact that WordPress is built on PHP, and a lot of people use WordPress. There are other content management solutions like Joomla and Drupal that also are built on PHP. There's a very nice framework called Laravel that's built on PHP. It's the first time that I've actually enjoyed writing PHP code in a long time. So props to Laravel and its creator, Taylor Otwell, for making it nice, and the community that helps maintain it too at this point. But there are a lot of jobs. There are a lot of interesting jobs, I should say. You might find yourself working at an agency that does PHP work. You might find yourself working at a big company that does PHP work. Facebook was infamously, maybe, built on PHP, and they've started migrating some of it to a language that they've built on top of PHP called Hack, which is not on this list, but that's okay. I don't actually know a ton about it, so I probably wouldn't be a good person to speak to it. But in addition to that, you can also find yourself building plugins for WordPress or plugins for Joomla or plugins for Drupal. There are a lot of different options for PHP. Documentation's actually pretty good. PHP is still widely used, so you have a lot of documentation that's available. 8.3 looks like the most recent release. PHP also famously skipped version 6, which is a fun story if you have a rabbit hole that you want to go down sometime. So View Online English. Cool. So getting started. That's not what I wanted. Your first PHP enabled page. This is important too. I hadn't really thought to mention this, but I'm glad that I'm thinking about it now. PHP can run inside of an HTML page, which means you can dynamically create HTML based on the contents of your PHP script that is running, which gets pretty wild and allows a lot of flexibility, and sometimes flexibility that can be misused. But it's something that PHP supports and does a pretty good job with. To my knowledge, PHP is still inherently stateless because everything runs in a script, and then it deallocates everything it needs. So there's a little bit of overhead when you're calling a PHP function, or not a PHP function, I'm sorry, a PHP script every time, or a page written in PHP. But it also is stateless, so it's not hanging around with state just waiting for the next person to call that page and to reuse that state. That may have changed. That also may be not relevant for someone who's just starting out. Sorry, I like to talk in depth about some of these things, but I also am trying to kind of cater it towards newer audiences. That is a code editor. Documentation's good. Job prospects, very good. I honestly might have to put PHP higher. That makes me sad. I don't like the language. It allows you to do things that are pretty bad, and things that are sloppy, and it's generally common to see sloppy PHP code. And I think the part that makes me not happy about PHP is that that's the case. It just so happens to be the case. There's nothing inherently bad about PHP that makes you write sloppy code, but I guess it's easy to write sloppy code. And it becomes very easy to kind of have HTML inside of PHP, or PHP inside of HTML, and then that PHP is producing HTML, and it's really hard to follow kind of how the page gets stitched together. A couple of things like that. So I could talk bad about PHP for a very long time. It's gotten a lot better. There are job prospects. The documentation's pretty good, and it's fairly beginner friendly as well. So it pains me to say it, but yeah, I think PHP would probably be A tier. This next one, I think this is PowerShell. It definitely needs to be probably C tier. PowerShell is kind of the Windows equivalent to Bash, and the only reason it's not on the same tier as Bash is that it's Windows only, or commonly only used with Windows. You may actually be able to use it with other operating systems now. I'm not certain. But you mostly see it used with Windows. And the fact of the matter is that most servers, not all of them, but most servers are running Linux. And part of that's because you're not paying for a Linux license to run the server since it's open source. Or if you're using Windows Server, you're paying for a Windows license. This adds up for companies with hundreds of thousands of servers, or tens of thousands, or even hundreds of servers. 10 servers, maybe? It adds up over time. So PowerShell is actually really nice from what I've seen. I have a friend who likes it quite a bit. He will script stuff in PowerShell pretty frequently. But at the end of the day, it's something that is a little bit more powerful than Bash, but a little less portable than Bash. So again, I mentioned the Midwest is kind of, Microsoft has its clutches on the Midwest for .NET and C#. Those places are likely to use PowerShell as well. It's great for scripting deployments if you choose to take that approach instead of using configuration-based deployments like Terraform. It seems really flexible. It seems like it runs really fast. Prospects, decent job prospects. I would say that not every C# shop is using PowerShell, but most PowerShell shops are probably using C#. They kind of go hand in hand. PowerShell. Oh yeah, it's Microsoft. So the documentation's pretty good. They do a pretty good job maintaining their documentation. And hey, look, it looks like you can use it on Linux and Mac. So maybe my comment about portability is no longer relevant. Their documentation's good. They do a good job keeping up with documentation on their tools and how to use them, and it benefits them for people to use their tools, so they are incentivized to do a good job keeping it up to date. It is a free tool, just like C#, so you're not paying for it, but if you do choose to do it on a Windows machine, you are potentially paying for a Windows license. Job prospects are good. Pretty easy to learn. I would say that's fairly true. I think you'll probably, one of the things you might run into is if you're trying to figure out how to do something in PowerShell and you Google it, you might find examples pointing to how to do it in Bash, because a lot of the work that you would do in these two is similar, but the reality is that they're different. And Bash code won't work in PowerShell, and PowerShell code will definitely not work in Bash. So just something to be aware of. If you're Googling for things, you might run into scenarios where if you say, like, how do I script copying a file into a new directory? You're probably going to find a Bash implementation quicker than you will a PowerShell implementation. Just something to be aware of. The language seems nice and flexible. It seems fairly easy to learn. To my knowledge, the error messaging is really good, too, when you have something go wrong. So, yeah, I'd say maybe C tier. Python, another language that I really don't care for. I don't have many bad things to say about it. It's just not for me. It uses indentation pretty heavily to determine scoping, which I don't like. And then historically, when Python 3 became a thing, there was a weird rift in the community that hopefully has recovered, but somewhat still feels like it has never really recovered. Job prospects are great. Python's used in machine learning applications all over the place. And another nice thing about C or C++ here is that sometimes those machine learning applications are using C or C++ under the hood too. But Python is generally the high-level language that kind of puts it all together. Python has a lot of really great libraries like Panda and NumPy that help with data management. They have libraries for data visualization, a lot of really great things. And then there's a concept known as Jupyter Notebooks or technology known as Jupyter Notebooks that allow you to visualize data with code in real time. You can actually use Jupyter Notebooks with a lot of different languages now, but I think by default, Python's probably the easiest one to set up and the most commonly used. If you're looking to get into data science or data engineering, Python's probably the one you want to choose. Those two things, and in addition to AI and ML, are becoming more and more popular. Probably, it's probably even increased in popularity since I started recording this video, or since you started watching this video, to now. And it will just continue to grow. So job prospects are fantastic for Python. In addition, that's not the only thing it's used for. You can build web servers using tools like Django or Flask. CherryPy is another one. Fast API is another really popular one that's kind of grown on the scene recently. A lot of options. It's unfortunate because, for me, it's unfortunate, I should say. I just don't like the language. But it seems, as I'm saying this, like a no-brainer that this would definitely be S tier. Documentation's pretty good. I think the only thing to be aware of is if you find some older documentation, you might be finding Python 2 code instead of Python 3 code. Yeah, it's kind of a pain. Some of it might work in Python 3. Most of it probably won't work in Python 3. If you're lucky, you'll find some hero who has also taken the solution that worked in Python 2 and converted it to work in Python 3 for you to kind of help you out. But you also might just have to get used to converting Python 2 code to Python 3, which means you might have to learn an older version of Python just to figure out what that code is doing and then to convert it to Python 3. That might not be as relevant anymore as it was, say, 8 years ago, but just something to be aware of. Ease of learning, yeah, it's generally considered a very easy and friendly language to learn. The indentation-based syntax is actually something that makes it nice for new beginners. It also helps visualize the scope and structure of your code. I just don't like it. Okay, definitely S tier, though. R is interesting. R is a language for working with data and has some great tools for visualizing data, but I feel like it's fallen out of popularity with Python having better support for that as time has gone on, or Python getting better support for that as time has gone on. There are some interesting use cases for R. If you have data visualization goals as a hobby, R is probably an excellent language to use. I just don't know what the future looks like for R with Python gaining so much momentum in that space. I'm going to put it probably D tier. The documentation's fine. Maybe. Okay. rproject.org. So yeah. The documentation's fine. They have examples. Where are their examples? Getting help, the R journal, books, certification. Their site is different than I remember. But essentially, yeah, it allows you to visualize data like this, and it provides tools for visualizing that data. There are tools for converting that into a web server. R language tutorial. Kind of bummed that they don't seem to have any any tutorial or getting started documentation on the R project. R for beginners, maybe. Yeah, maybe start here. Yeah, this actually seems kind of like what I would expect. So a lot of it's taking data in, doing some operations on that data, and then visualizing it with graphics. That's R in a nutshell. There might be some other use cases for it, but the common ones would be that, and like statistical analysis, for example. So this is probably pretty good documentation, but I'm actually a little bummed at how few documentation examples came up, especially first-party ones when I was searching for that. So yeah, I would say D tier probably seems fitting. Not a ton of job prospects. Likely with Python kind of taking over that space, and then documentation kind of being lackluster. I guess one of the selling points for R, though, is that it's probably pretty fairly easy to learn. The little I've done in R felt pretty straightforward. That being said, I do feel like R has a weird thing. Is it R language array index? I feel like their array indexes start with 1 instead of 0, where every other programming language, yes, okay, in R, array indexes start at 1. That's the thing that frustrated me like heck about this language. So almost every other language on this list uses 0-based indexing. So if you wanted the first item in an array or a list, it would be the 0th item. But in R, it would be the first item. This actually makes more sense when you vocalize it, but when you learn every other language and every other language does it this way, it becomes a little weird to think about that R does it differently for some reason. Okay. Ruby. Ruby is an interesting language too. You get to hang out with Java and Kotlin. So Ruby is a programming language that's kind of focused on simplicity. It's often referred to as a very beautiful language because the code can be very beautiful to look at compared to some of the other items on this list. And it's very flexible. It's a very flexible language. It is dynamic, which is nice in a lot of cases. It runs on the Ruby virtual machine. And it's just really flexible. So the Ruby programming language has good documentation. So if you want to get into learning Ruby, you can here. You can use Ruby for scripting, kind of. It's maybe not the most popular option for that, although people still do use it for scripting, and it has been used for scripting in the past. one of the big selling points for Ruby is specifically Ruby on Rails. So this is an extremely popular web framework for building web servers in Ruby. Not going to watch a video. Some people that are using it, all that fun stuff. GitHub uses it, which is interesting. Basecamp uses it. They are the people that kind of steward Ruby on Rails. Basecamp being DHH in team. Hey, also Basecamp, same company. Yeah, so here's some examples. So Ruby on Rails takes care of basically everything that you would need for building a web service. You define your models. It uses a thing called active record to take care of writing this to the database for you. And it allows you to effectively write code like this that defines how your application behaves when it's called. Documentation's pretty good. Job prospects are good. I don't think they're really decreasing. I don't think they're increasing as much as they have in the past too. But they're also, to my knowledge, not really decreasing. I think Shopify also uses Ruby, maybe Ruby on Rails, which is another good use case to be aware of. Ease of use, it's an extremely easy to use language. I know we're looking at Ruby on Rails instead of just Ruby in particular here, but Ruby is focused on being a programmer's best friend and very easy to use. So again, here's an example. This is an interesting example because this is technically a hello world, but there's some extra choices here that were made to wrap all this in a class and put this behind methods. It could be even simpler, like literally puts hello world is all you need to do a hello world program in Ruby. So very simple language to learn, very flexible, which is nice, especially if you're just starting out with programming. And then documentation's pretty good. When I say that, now I feel like it needs to be higher on the list. So, but when I look at the other options higher up, I don't feel like it fits among them. So it almost needs its own tier, but we'll skip creating a new tier at this point. We'll just keep it in B. I'll move it to the front of B tier, though. Hopefully that helps. This invisible one is actually not invisible. This is the logo for Rust, the Rust programming language. I'm going to put Rust in B tier, and I'll tell you why. Rust is an alternative to C++. They're kind of... that's not fair to say. It solves a lot of the same problems that you could with C++. It's a very fast language. It's focused on solving some of C++'s problems, like memory safety. And it is a very modern language as well, with a lot of modern tooling, kind of similar to Go, which is really nice. Rust is hard to learn. I think I'm a pretty good developer, but learning Rust was a challenge for me. Had no issue with Clojure, which again is a common Lisp. It's very different than anything else. We talked a little bit about learning common Lisp after learning others. But learning Rust was kind of a pain. So it took some time, a couple of attempts really, with some time in between, and I think I have a good understanding of how Rust operates. That being said, it can be a challenging language. And part of the challenge is that it's very safe and sound. And what that means is when you write code that's wrong, you generally end up in a scenario where you are getting errors from the compiler and you're trying to figure out what those errors mean. So you fix that error and then you get another error from the compiler. And you in a way, it's nice because it feels like someone is pair programming with you and they're helping you kind of write correct code. And the compiler does a really good job of this compared to some other languages. But it can be very frustrating to spend a bunch of time bartering. It feels like bartering with the compiler sometimes. And for new devs, that can be really frustrating. It's a fantastic language. I, at some point, would recommend people learn it. I think it has a huge future in web development. It has a huge future in the JavaScript ecosystem. It's kind of funny. A lot of JavaScript tools, like tools built for JavaScript, are being rewritten in from JavaScript in Rust because it's faster and safer, which is fantastic. And I think it will continue to grow in popularity, and hopefully there will be more options that help people learn Rust in a little bit of an easier way. What else? Job prospects, they're pretty good. Because the language is hard, there are some companies that are choosing to not use it. There are probably a lot of companies that are choosing not to use it, but there are some companies that are choosing to use it, and it makes sense for their use case because it is so performant and safe and secure. And like when you hear that, it sounds like, yeah, no joke. Why wouldn't we want this? And the reason is that it can be difficult, and you have to pay Rust developers instead of paying other people, which often also means that Rust developers generally get paid a pretty good salary. Documentation's pretty good. I actually have very few complaints about the documentation. The tutorials for Rust, this is Ruby again, Lang, are pretty good. This is a tangent. I love these colors on their site. Small tangent. This Learn tab right here, this book is fantastic. My copy's downstairs. I have a copy of this book, or the Rust book. It might not be one-to-one, downstairs that I bought a physical copy of and went through and learned a ton. Steve Klabnik and Carol Nichols taught me a ton from this book, so just a shout out to them. But yeah, this is the part that trips people up. Ownership. So if you want to learn about this and references and borrowing, and you know how in Go I mentioned we have pointers, and in C#, or not C#, in C++ we have pointers, and C we have pointers. Rust has a unique way of handling that with references and borrowing and ownership, and this is the part that trips people up. So if you read through this and this all makes sense to you, maybe Rust is a great choice. Documentation's good. Job prospects are pretty good. And then the language is just a little difficult. But with even the negatives of it being difficult, I'm still going to put it B tier. I wish it was a little more visible. Almost done. Swift. You get to hang out next to Kotlin. So Swift is the replacement for a language that didn't make this list. So the language that didn't make this list is Objective-C. So Objective-C was built by Apple a while back. It was Apple's version of C for their operating systems. So if you built Mac apps, you were building them in Objective-C. When iPhones came out, you were building iOS apps in Objective-C. For a while, you were building iPad apps in Objective-C. And then I think people started to realize that, hey, this language feels old and kind of crusty. And it truly does. So Apple put out a new language called Swift, and it's similar to Kotlin. It's actually very similar to Kotlin. Swift is really nice. You can use it for other things, like web servers as well. There's a really nice Swift web server framework. Is it Falcon? Swift web server? Vapor, maybe? I think it is Vapor. Falcon might be something else. Falcon might be the C++ one. So there's a really nice web server for building web applications, web APIs in Swift, which is great. And then if you're building iOS apps, Mac apps, iPad apps, watch apps, I would assume Apple Vision Pro apps, whatever they come up with next, you're probably going to be using Swift. So if you want to do Mac things or Apple things, this language suddenly becomes S tier. There's no better option. But if you are, just looking for a language with employability prospects and ease of learning and stuff like that, Swift is probably B tier. I would say it's pretty similar to Kotlin. It actually might be ahead of Kotlin in the list too. What else? There's an interesting thing we didn't talk about. That is, there's a concept of building applications in languages that are not the sanctioned language by the mobile operating systems. So the mobile operating systems being, for Android, anything that runs on a JVM technically can work, but it's Java and Kotlin. And then for iOS and Mac and all that jazz, it's Objective-C and Swift. There are tools like React Native, which allow you to build mobile applications in JavaScript. Actually, one of my favorite languages, not even on the list, it's called Dart. And it allows you to build, using a framework called Flutter, you can build iOS and Android and Mac and Windows and Linux and web applications using Flutter and Dart. Kind of sad it's not on the list. I would go find it and put it here, but this video has been going on for a long time, so we'll wrap it up. That being said, I would probably put Dart also somewhere up here. Resources are great. So similarly to how Microsoft does really good documentation for their products, Apple does really good documentation for Swift. I think probably the only hard part about Swift on the documentation front is that if you're trying to figure out how to do things for iOS or for macOS, you're probably going to find examples pointing to Objective-C, just because it's been around for so long. But you might find newer stuff pointing to Swift as well. A nice thing that Apple does, I believe they have an Objective-C to Swift compiler in Xcode. So if your code meets certain expectations, I believe they can transpile it from Objective-C to Swift for you. Could be wrong on that, though. Job prospects, we talked a little bit about this. Ease of use, yeah, it's a pretty easy language to get started with, and a lot of really great documentation to get started with, too. Visual Basic. Based off my criteria, this is actually a really hard one to place. Visual Basic is basic. It's intended to be a beginner's programming language, something that people can just get started with, or a language for people who don't program full-time. So if you want to build a Windows application with a form that allows you to select a file and it removes the first line of the file and then saves the rest of it. So maybe you build a little Windows form application to remove the headers from a CSV file or an Excel file or something. Visual Basic is that's what it's built for. It's a fantastic tool for that. Very basic, very easy to use. So that's a selling point. Documentation's pretty good. It's becoming, I don't know what Microsoft's long-term plan is for Visual Basic. It's still used. It's still fairly popular. But they're definitely investing more in C# than they are Visual Basic. Just something to be aware of. I think they solve different problems, so they probably, one's not going to cancel the other out, but just something to be aware of. And then job prospects. I kind of mentioned this. It's basic, so you're not going to find really high-performance applications built in Visual Basic. You're not going to find, to my knowledge, web servers that are built in Visual Basic, or web UIs built in Visual Basic, or mobile. Yeah, I don't think you can build mobile apps in Visual Basic. You might be able to, actually. That's kind of scary. So yeah, you won't find those things, but it's actually a really great tool if you are, I don't know, maybe an accountant, or if you are in HR and you see the ability to automate some things or to build a basic program to help you with certain day-to-day tasks. Visual Basic is an excellent choice for that. I'll also shout out Python. If you don't need a GUI, you don't need a visual piece, and you're comfortable with the command line, Python's actually a really great language for scripting and automating day-to-day tasks. In fact, while we're shelling out for books, automate the boring stuff with Python. This book is all about taking Python to write programs that do things that would take you a lot of time. So search for text in a file or across multiple files. Create, update, move, and rename files and folders. These are things that people just do in their job, right? But if you know Python, you can write a script and run that script to do these things for you. And that script becomes really nice when you introduce variables, because now you can use the script multiple times for different scenarios, different files, different projects, and that script will still work. Excuse me. Okay, I think we hit the end. We mentioned we're not doing MySQL since it's a language used to communicate with the database and not like a full-on programming language. So I think we're good. There are a couple things missing from the list. There's not Scala. There's not Clojure. Honestly, I wouldn't recommend either of them for new developers. In fact, I probably wouldn't recommend anything below B tier for new developers. Confirming. Yeah, I stand by that statement. Obviously, S tier is what I would recommend the most. A tier is not organized in... Now it is. A tier is organized based off of, next priority. B is probably now also organized in priority. So if you were to pick a new language, without a doubt, my recommendation would be JavaScript. The only exception would be if you say, I really want to get into data engineering or AI or ML or data science. Python would be what I would recommend. And then the rest of this becomes kind of situational. So PHP is still a great choice. It's great if you want to do your own thing, especially because it allows you to work with what you have and kind of stitch everything together. Go is really great for cloud native solutions. It's very fast. It's as far as like the C competitors kind of go. I know that it's not one-to-one with Go and C. Go is probably the easiest to use tool for solving similar problems. And then C Sharps are actually a really great language. Okay, this has gone on for a really long time. I did not expect it to go on this long, but hopefully this has been helpful. This was actually really fun to make. I might try to make more tiers again. And just as a friendly reminder, these are based on what I would recommend new devs look at learning. So if you are choosing a bootcamp, or if you are choosing a self-study course, or if you're putting together your own, like, I need to learn to program, so here's what I'm going to do for 30 minutes on my break. These are the languages that I would recommend using, one of these two. And these possibly being the first choice. That being said, every S, A, B, all of these are great tools to learn at some point in your career. Hopefully this was helpful, and have a fantastic day.